Think you know the whole story? Turns out you were probably taught the half-truth. Welcome to Half-Truths. Close your eyes for a moment. I want you to picture the American West, circa 1880. You know the scene. The sun is beating down on a dusty main street. A tumbleweed rolls by, almost on cue. The saloon doors swing open with a creak, and the piano player abruptly stops playing. Two men step into the street. They are rugged, stoic, and armed to the teeth. The townspeople scatter, hiding behind barrels and peering out from windows. It is high noon. The clock tower chimes. Hands hover over holstered Colt 45s. It is a moment of pure, lawless tension where the only thing that separates order from chaos is the speed of a man's draw. This is the foundational myth of the American frontier. It is the image we grew up with. From the black and white flickering screens of the 1950s to the gritty reboots of today, we are taught that the West was a place of unbridled freedom and constant danger. We are told it was a land where the government was non-existent, where every man was a sovereign nation unto himself, and where disputes were settled with hot lead rather than a gavel. We love this story. It appeals to something deep in our psyche. It feels dangerous, romantic, and uniquely American. It is the story of the rugged individual conquering the savage wilderness. It is the story of how the West was won. But I have to ask you a question. What if that story is a lie? What if I told you that in many of those famous frontier towns, you were less likely to be murdered than you are in Baltimore or Chicago today? What if I told you that the cowboy, that quintessential symbol of white American masculinity, was actually a low-wage laborer who was just as likely to speak Spanish or have been born into slavery as he was to look like John Wayne? And here is the real kicker. What if I told you that the very towns famous for their shootouts actually had gun control laws so strict they would make a modern politician blush? Welcome to Half-Truths. Today, we are holstering the myth and drawing the truth. We are riding into the sunset of the Hollywood Western to find out what actually happened when the cameras were not rolling. Because the reality of the Wild West is not about how wild it was. It is about how desperate we were to invent a legend that never existed. Let us start by looking at the story we all know. The myth of the Wild West is built on three main pillars. First, that violence was ubiquitous. If you looked at someone the wrong way in a saloon, you got shot. Second, that everyone carried a gun everywhere. The six-shooter was as essential as a pair of boots. And third, that the heroes of this era were white men bringing civilization to a savage land. This mythology suggests that the frontier was a place of anarchy. It was the Hobbiesian trap, a war of all against all. In this version of history, the only law was the code of the West. You defended your property, you defended your honor, and you never shot a man in the back. This narrative has been fed to us for over a century. It suggests that the United States was forged in fire and blood by men who needed no government to tell them right from wrong. It is a compelling narrative because it simplifies morality. There are white hats and there are black hats, good guys and bad guys. The good guy is reluctant to fight, but when pushed, he is faster and more accurate than the villain. It validates a specific worldview that violence is a necessary tool for peace and that armed citizens are the only true guarantors of safety. But we have to ask ourselves, where did this specific version of history come from? Did it rise organically from the diaries of settlers and the court records of the territories? Not exactly. To find the source of the Wild West myth, we do not look to historians. We look to showmen and novelists. The primary architect of the Wild West legend was William F. Cody, better known as Buffalo Bill. In the late 19th century, just as the actual frontier was closing and the fencing of the open range was turning cowboying into a standard industrial job, Cody launched Buffalo Bill's Wild West. This was not a history lesson. It was a traveling circus. It was a spectacular piece of theater designed to sell tickets to people in the East and in Europe who were fascinated by the exotic tales of the American interior. Cody took the dusty, boring, and often grim reality of frontier life and turned it into an action movie. He hired sharpshooters like Annie Oakley and staged elaborate reenactments of battles and robberies. He condensed the vast, empty boredom of the plains into 2 hours of adrenaline. He gave the audience exactly what they wanted: excitement, danger, and a clear victory for his version of civilization. At the same time, the dime novel industry was exploding. Writers like Ned Buntline churned out cheap, sensationalized paperbacks by the thousands. They took real figures like Wild Bill Hickok and Calamity Jane and turned them into superheroes. They invented shootouts that never happened and exaggerated kill counts by orders of magnitude. These writers were not interested in facts. They were paid by the word to entertain bored city dwellers in New York and Philadelphia. They created a feedback loop where the public expected blood and guts, so the writers provided it, which made the public believe the West was even bloodier than they thought. Then came Hollywood. In the 20th century, the Western became the dominant genre of American cinema. For decades, studios churned out thousands of films that cemented the visual language of the myth: the quick draw, the street duel, the barroom brawl. These tropes were necessary for visual storytelling. A movie needs conflict, and a negotiation over grazing rights is not nearly as cinematic as a gunfight at the OK Corral. Hollywood needed the West to be wild because a tame West is boring box office. So, we have a myth built by circus ringmasters, pulp fiction writers, and movie producers. Now, let us pull the thread and see what unravels. Let us look at the actual data. When historians dig into the arrest records, coroner's reports, and court documents from the most notorious frontier towns, a very different picture emerges. Let us take the heavy hitters: Dodge City, Tombstone, Deadwood, Abilene. These names are synonymous with murder and mayhem. In reality, they were shockingly peaceful. Let us look at the numbers. In Dodge City, Kansas, during its wildest years, from 1876 to 1885, there were a total of 15 homicides. That is it, 15. That averages out to about 1.5 murders per year. In Tombstone, Arizona, the year of the famous OK Corral shootout, there were only 5 murders. In Deadwood, South Dakota, another legendary den of iniquity, there were only 4 murders in its deadliest year. To put that in perspective, if you adjust for population, these towns had homicide rates that were often lower than many modern American cities. And the violence that did happen was rarely the dramatic street duel between a hero and a villain. It was usually a drunken argument in a brothel or a gambling dispute that turned ugly. The romantic notion of 2 men facing off in the street at high noon is almost entirely a Hollywood invention. There are almost no recorded instances of a formalized quick-draw duel happening in the real Wild West. It is a tactical absurdity. No one who wants to survive a gunfight stands out in the open and waits for the other guy to move. But the biggest record-scratch moment comes when we talk about guns themselves. The prevailing myth is that everyone carried a gun, and the government stayed out of it. The reality is that the leaders of these frontier towns were obsessed with gun control. These towns were businesses. They were trying to attract investors, settlers, and the railroad. They wanted to be seen as civilized, stable places to raise a family or open a bank. A town where drunken cowboys were shooting up the signage was bad for property values. It scared away capital. So, as soon as a town was incorporated, the first thing that the town council usually did was pass an ordinance prohibiting the carrying of firearms within city limits. When you rode into a cattle town like Wichita or Dodge City, you were met by a large sign at the edge of town or at the bridge. It explicitly stated that the carrying of firearms was prohibited. This was not a suggestion. It was the law. Upon arrival, a cowboy was expected to go to the sheriff's office, or sometimes a hotel or stable, and check his guns. He would receive a metal token, like a coat check ticket. He could retrieve his weapons only when he was leaving town to go back out on the range. The irony is thick. The very figures we associate with gunslinging freedom were actually the enforcers of strict gun control. Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, Wild Bill Hickok. These men were law officers. Their job was to walk up to armed men and tell them to hand over their weapons or get out of town. Let us re-examine the most famous gunfight in history, the gunfight at the OK Corral. In the movie versions, this is usually portrayed as a battle between good and evil. But legally speaking, what was it about? It was an arrest gone wrong. Virgil Earp was the town marshal. He and his brothers, along with Doc Holliday, went to disarm a group of cowboys who were violating a local ordinance by carrying weapons in public. The cowboys refused to hand over their guns. Shooting started. The entire conflict was a police enforcement action regarding gun control legislation. So, the towns were safer than we thought, and the guns were heavily regulated. Now let us look at the people. The Hollywood version of the cowboy is almost exclusively white. He is a distinct ethnic archetype. But if you were to transport yourself back to a cattle drive in the 1870s, you would see a workforce that was radically more diverse. The very word cowboy has a history that Hollywood conveniently scrubbed. In the early days, white men who worked with cattle were called drovers or cattle handlers. The term boy was often used in a derogatory way to describe servants or slaves. As the profession evolved, the term stuck, but the demographics remained incredibly mixed. Historians estimate that at least 1 in 4 cowboys was black. Following the Civil War, thousands of formerly enslaved men moved west. The frontier offered a rare opportunity. It was hard, dirty, dangerous work, and because of that, there was a level of meritocracy that did not exist in the Jim Crow South. A steer does not care about the color of the skin of the man roping it. It only cares if the rope is tight. If you could ride and you could shoot, you could get a job. One of the most fascinating figures of this era was Bass Reeves. Reeves was born into slavery, escaped into indigenous territory during the Civil War, and later became a deputy U.S. Marshal. Over his career, he arrested more than 3,000 felons. He was a master of disguise, an expert marksman, and he rode a white horse. Many historians believe that Bass Reeves was the actual inspiration for the character of the Lone Ranger. Yet, for decades, the Lone Ranger was played by a white man in a mask, and Reeves was relegated to the footnotes of history books. Then you have the Mexican influence. This is perhaps the most glaring omission. The entire culture of the American cowboy is a direct appropriation of the Mexican vaquero. The vaqueros had been herding cattle in the Southwest and Mexico for centuries before English-speaking settlers arrived. Everything we associate with the cowboy toolkit comes from the Spanish tradition. The word rodeo, Spanish. The word chaps, short for chaparreras. The lariat, from la riata. Even the word buckaroo is just an anglicized mispronunciation of vaquero. The hat, the saddle, the techniques of roping and branding, these were all developed by Mexican and indigenous herders. When white settlers moved into Texas and the Southwest, they did not invent the cattle industry. They adopted the technology and culture of the vaqueros who were already there. But when Hollywood turned the camera on the West, they whitewashed the cast. They took the clothes, the words, and the skills of Black and Mexican laborers and put them on actors like Gary Cooper and John Wayne. They created a nationalist myth that erased the very people who built the reality. So, why does this matter? Why should we care if the movies got it wrong? It matters because myths have power. The myth of the Wild West has shaped our national identity. It has influenced our politics, our stance on gun laws, and our understanding of what it means to be an American. By believing in the Hollywood West, we accept the idea that violence is an inherent, unsolvable part of the American character. We accept the idea that safety comes from individual firepower rather than community agreement and law. We look back at a golden age of freedom that never actually existed, and we use it to justify policies in the present. The truth of the West is actually far more interesting than the fiction. It is not a story of lone wolves and shootouts. It is a story of diverse groups of people, Black, white, Mexican, indigenous, Chinese, struggling to build communities in a harsh environment. It is a story of people who understood that to survive the wilderness, you did not need to be a law unto yourself. You needed to cooperate. You needed rules. You needed to hang your guns at the door so you could sit down and have a drink with your neighbor without getting shot. The real West was not tamed by the gun. It was tamed by the law, by the fence, by the railroad, and by the contract. It was tamed by people who realized that a town where everyone is armed and angry is not a place where anyone can prosper. We often think that debunking a myth ruins the magic. We think that realizing the cowboy was a low-paid, diverse, union-forming laborer ruins the romance. But I argue the opposite. The myth is a cartoon. The reality is human. The reality shows us that even in the most rugged environments, human beings naturally drift toward order, not chaos. It shows us that diversity is not a modern invention, but a historical constant. So the next time you see a Western, enjoy the cinematography. Enjoy the drama. But remember that the empty holster at the hip of a cowboy walking through Dodge City is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of civilization. And that, surprisingly, is the wildest truth of all. Now you know the real story. What other half-truths are still out there? If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a comment, and join us next time. Until then, stay curious.